necessarily immediately after it. What I would like to do is to try and, in a sense, bookend the film. Bookend it by saying a little bit about what has happened and what is happening now in Egypt. But probably more importantly, to give a background as to why the revolution on the 25th of January took place, and to put the context of the idea that often came through in the film, that it was also a view that was expressed very much in Western media, that this was a revolution or an uprising, and I think we can debate that, which of it it is. But it was a view that somehow 25th of January took place because of Facebook, because of social media. And there's a lot of evidence to certainly indicate that the terrible murder of Khalid Said in June 2010 was a critical catalyst for mobilizing around social networking. What I want to try and indicate, though, is that you can't possibly understand the film that we just saw without understanding the immense struggle and contested debate in Egypt for more than 30 years. And what's interesting is, in many ways, this was a revolution that shouldn't have happened. Arabs were asleep. They were likened by journalists as being mice in the street. Or the regime was so totalitarian, political scientists would argue that it was impossible to undermine the pillars or the bedrock of that authoritarian regime. So how do we set the context for understanding the struggle and the immense struggle, the immense contested conflict that emerged, without understanding actually the nonsense that was written about the revolution or the uprising, the nonsense that reified the idea of Facebook and which ignored an incredible history of struggle and uprising that preceded January 25, and which actually sets a context for understanding what I will suggest is the long-term background to the revolution, the medium-term context within which the revolution took place, and then the short-term mobilization that we saw the film, almost an ethnography of the square, which of course was fascinating in terms of the incredible debates that were taking place, as well as the bloodshed that was being spilled to get rid of the dictator. In many ways, I suppose, when I saw that caption in the film, The End, it should really perhaps have read The Beginning. Because after the celebration of the removal of Mubarak, there was a incredibly violent 18 months of very highly militarized and bloodshed in and around both Cairo and outside in Port Said. Let me say a little bit, though, just to reinforce what I said about bookending. Let me say a little bit about the now, some of the achievements of the revolution and the challenges that are confronted the new regime, the new government now, and then to go on to explain why understanding the backdrop to the revolution is important, and the historical struggles of contested arenas in politics, and a new politics that emerges in and around the square. Now, after 100 days in office, the new President Morsi was implicated by association as President of the government of Egypt, was implicated by Human Rights Watch as overseeing 88 torture cases, 34 killings, and many sexual assaults. This was a report issued last week by Human Rights Watch, indicating that there is still considerable violence and disorder in the new Egypt. What perhaps wasn't immediately evident from the film that we saw was that the contest between January 25 and 11 of February led to more than 850 killed and 7,000 injured. And many of the injured were blinded, almost as a direct strategy by the police to fire rubber bullets either into the face or into the chest, and the impact destroying people's sights. What has been very troubling, and I think we can discuss this, is the role that the military played after the pushing out of government of Mubarak. Because during the struggle, certainly in the early days of the post-Mubarak period, there were some wonderful associations and links that the army and the people are one hand. They are clearly connected and linked to the building of a new Egypt. But alongside the rhetoric of the army and the people being one hand, there were also a lot of cartoons emerging indicating that the military were whispering into the ears of Islamists and also whispering into the ears of the Coptic Christians, as if somehow to establish a context that sectarianism would emerge unless the military could maintain law and order. So there is a clear reflection on the role that the military plays after the revolution and the forms that the contested arena take. And one of those, well, there are 3 or 4 major incidents that I think need to be not sidestepped. One was in October 2011, when 28 people were killed demonstrating outside of the broadcasting studios in Maspero. A devastating attack on civilians by the military, who simply drove into crowds of demonstrators who were urging liberalization of media and the new Egypt that was emerging after the revolution. On the 16th of December 14 were killed in Tahrir during demonstrations, and women were particularly beaten and assaulted. And perhaps the most dramatic, the one which I'm sure most of you have heard, was the 1st of February massacre of Al-Ahli's ultras, football supporters, in Port Said, when 74 people were killed, supporters were killed, inside the stadium. At a time when the gates of the stadium were locked, the police became onlookers, and the thugs who had been paid by remnants of the old regime laid into and attacked and slaughtered the football supporters. The military almost couldn't let go the idea that the ultras were such a significant and important element of the mobilization in the square. They were at the forefront of the struggle against the thugs and the police, and they were very well organized and disciplined. Of course, the ultras, like many football supporters worldwide, are quite expert in ducking and diving when it comes to dealing with the forces of law and disorder. And the ultras were no surprise to that. But it was almost as if Tantawi, the field marshal, would not let this go, and that Port Said was payback time. And that also then, of course, raised questions, just what kind of new Egypt was emerging, and how could it be possible somehow to remove the military from politics? This becomes a persistent feature of the post-revolutionary period. How to get the military back to barracks. We know from historical illustrations that it's quite easy for the military to intervene. They do, after all, usually have the monopoly of the forces of coercion. But getting them back to barracks is often extremely problematic. And getting them back to barracks when their wrongdoing is not when the military are not charged for their wrongdoing, becomes increasingly difficult. And we've seen that very much in the case of Egypt. November last year, there were massive demonstrations outside the Interior Ministry when more than 19 were killed, almost 800 were injured. So the demonstrations continue. And yet we saw, of course, the wonderful joyousness of simply getting rid of Mubarak. Getting rid of Mubarak, in a sense, was easy. Getting rid of the regime and the remnants of the regime has become much more problematic. Removing the military, not simply from politics, but from its place and location in the economy, is extremely problematic and a major challenge for a new Egypt. The Egyptian military produce everything from cars to seaside resorts, holiday resorts. They control more than 40% of the economy. This is a corporate interest which is not going to simply be given up very easily. Hard-felt interests within a corporate entity like the military. So that may give some explanation as to why the post-revolutionary reconstruction period was not very straightforward. Counter-revolutionary forces are notorious in their ability to seek to undermine the revolutionary challenges of those who are creating a new political tomorrow. But let's not be too downcast. There were some immense achievements, not least getting rid of a 30-year dictator. There were also new constitutional amendments which reduced the presidential term, the future presidential terms, to just 2 terms. There was a much broader range of the franchise, and the idea that a wider spread of people could stand for president. And of course also the reintroduction of judicial oversight over the electoral process, both in the parliamentary process and in the presidential process. And there has been the prosecution of corrupt officials. They haven't always been successful. And there's much business about the persistent evidence that the old remnants continue to provide access or have access to the economy and powerful political forces. But nevertheless, that's not too bad an achievement list when you reflect on the monopoly of power that the military and the erstwhile regime had. But against those achievements, you have to then also reflect a little bit on what the immediate challenges are. And those immediate challenges for the new Prime Minister in nominating a cabinet that's the biggest of all time, which has only 2 women. It has the old guard in positions of finance, foreign affairs, and defense. It has Islamists, and one shouldn't be surprised at that because Islamists won more than 60% of the positions in the Majlis al-Shab. They have Islamists in important ministries of education, information, youth, and labour. And the Prime Minister has recently been confronted by trying to mediate or extinguish, under quite considerable US and Israeli pressure, attacks on Egyptian border posts in the Sinai. So the in-basket, if you like, the in-tray of the new government is really quite a extensively difficult one, and not least how the economy can grow and reduce the consequences of not simply 2 years of very sluggish growth, but how the economy can be more diversified to increase the opportunity for employment and creating new areas of growth and development. The big key issue, which is literally being debated now, last week the draft constitution was revealed. A clear debate for secularists is the extent to which that constitution will be Islamist in terms of using the Sharia as an interpretation of jurisprudence and law. And the other issue, of course, and I can keep repeating this, is what happens to the military. The military, soon after getting rid of Mubarak, was very clear to say, we will not show you, the new parliament, our books. We will not show you the accounts and we will not have your intervention in our economic activity. Quite a big hurdle for any regime which historically has been so dominated by the military. But how do we get here? How do we get to Midan Tahrir, and how did we get to the possibility, almost in a sense, the coming together of a perfect storm to politically transform the status quo in Egypt? And at one level, as I said already, well, this shouldn't have happened. Well, one reason why it shouldn't have happened was that if you look at the economic indices of Egypt in terms of its levels of economic growth, if you look at the period between 1980 and 2004, there was roughly a 3% per capita increase in people's income. There was an average something like a 5% increase in gross national product. Any developing country would give their right arm, if I can use that metaphor, for such economic indices. Extraordinary economic growth, driven, however, by rent. Rents from Suez, from oil and gas, labour remittances. And one of the difficulties that has repeatedly confronted all regimes in Egypt is how to promote a greater diversification of the economy away from rent towards the production and manufacture of growth and employment. Employment required for such a labour surplus economy. We just park that on the back burner because this is something which I think will constantly revisit any discussion we may have, and certainly will shape the character of economic policy making in Egypt. Remember that the regime is now currently debating the prospect of a $4.8 billion loan from the IMF to offset the shortfall in income generation for its national budget. In a sense, the reflection on the economic figures that I've just mentioned in terms of growth, in a sense, the comment on that is basically Egypt grew, but Egyptians didn't. What a conundrum. Egypt grew, but Egyptians didn't. Alongside those incredibly strong growth figures, more than 44% of Egyptians living on less than $2 a day. If you look in the countryside, some commentators argue more than 80% of rural Egyptians are living on less, or living, I use that term loosely, eking out an existence on $2 a day. That would make poverty, rural poverty in Egypt, similar to poverty levels in rural Zimbabwe. And that's not a comparator that many Egyptians would choose to reflect on or think was appropriate. Alongside the economic growth, and alongside the increase in people's immiseration and poverty, was also a regime that used and practiced systemic and systematic torture as a mechanism for maintaining political control and exercising or trying to establish an idea of local legitimacy. And one can't underestimate the role that torture and routine abuse of people's rights played in the long-term build-up of the revolutionary fervour that the movie reflected on. In terms of the long term, I suppose where I would draw the line would be 2008. Of course, we know 2008 is the onset of our own crisis in the advanced capitalist countries. But in 2008, people were dying in bread queues in Cairo. Now, any regime that had half a brain would think, hey, something ain't quite right here. And this is a challenge, ultimately will become a challenge to us if we can't deliver food security in the capital city. But no, this is an authoritarian regime that had a sense of its own position and presence and its arrogance in dealing with urban Cairenes. These are some of the long-term consequences, some long-term causes of the perfect storm. Okay, the medium term was really affirmed by raging food inflation between 2005 and 2010 of something like 20%. Tremendous worker opposition and worker struggles to increase the minimum wage from £115 to £1,200, 1,200 Egyptian pounds, that is, a month. And bear in mind that a family of four live below the poverty line if they are on 1,200 Egyptian pounds a month. Between 2004 and 9, there was something like 2 million worker days lost through industrial action. Most incredibly powerful, ongoing, systematic labour response to enforced immiseration and austerity. And in particular, what happened in 2006 was a major uprising in a textile city called Mahalla, north of Cairo, which houses something like 28,000 industrial workers. This is the greatest concentration of an industrial working class of anywhere in the Middle East. And the struggles that took place in Mahalla, struggling against false promises and the failure of the regime to deliver on changes in pay and conditions, led to something which we won't see as being very dramatic, but which probably was one of the most clear indices that the regime, or certainly Mubarak, was doomed. And that is, people started defaming and pulling down posters and pictures of Mubarak. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, one characterization of Egyptian politics is that it was a democracy of newspapers. You could say and do pretty much what you liked within certain circumscribed areas, as long as you did not criticize the president, Suzanne, his missus, or the two boys, Allah and Gamal. If you strode into that area, you were very quickly inquired into in terms of what it was that you were actually seeking to do. What's significant is that after 2004, there was a new prime minister called Ahmed Nazif, who drove a very aggressive neoliberal strategy of trying to reduce wage levels, or at least refuse to improve working conditions. And alongside this, and something which we really do not hear about in the West, is that there was a tremendous rural struggle in the countryside. A rural struggle that was contesting repeatedly a change in legislation that took place in 1992, which was a change in land tenure relations, which abrogated the Nasserist legislation of the 50s, where people had rights in perpetuity to the land. This was broken by Law 96 of 1992, and it led to repeatedly annual deaths, conflicts, fights, struggles over land ownership. Usually around 250 people killed a year, thousands injured. Significant brutalization of peasants and farmers by local forces of law and order. This rural dimension, the rural aspect, I think, is something which is often very much underplayed in the process of the emergence of the perfect storm. But something else was happening. One was a tremendous mobilization against and support for the Iraqis against the US and UK-led invasion in Iraq. Second was an incredible mobilization of people on the streets in support of the Palestinians in the Second Intifada. And linked to that was the emergence of a social movement called Kifaya. Enough. Enough that you think you can put your son to replace you as president, but also enough that we will get rid of this odious presence of the Israelis on Arab soil. So there was a coming together of the kind of potential pan-Arabist struggle with a recognition that there was a groundswell of opposition against the regime, and certainly against the idea that the president could simply put in place one of his boys to become the new prime minister, new president. So we have a long-term consequences, growth amid rising poverty. We have medium term in terms of neoliberal reforms after 2004, which accelerate the immiseration, but also lead to incredible independent working class action against the state and the regime, and support for neighbouring Arab struggles, which of course Mubarak always presented himself as being the defender of. But as he presented himself as the defender of Palestine, he stopped Egyptians from marching to Rafah to protest against Israel's continued occupation. So there was for the people on the street the emergence actually of a new politics, and that new politics emerged partly around kafaya, it partly emerged around people writing, sharing leaflets, dropping them in the street. Things which, as kind of an agitation for mobilization, had very much been hitherto underplayed. And of course the short term, the immediate catalyst was the awful murder of Khalid Said in June 10. Here was a young man who was beaten up in public by the police in Alexandria, killed. His mouth was then stuffed with narcotics, and his death was explained as an asphyxiation from the ingestion of those drugs. And in a sense, it was a culmination of people's understanding that actually that's enough. The bringing together of working class industrial militancy, rural struggles to contest new landlords, a new urban politics built around social movements and mobilizations, first in support of Palestine and the greater Arab unity, but also around the need to get rid of the president, is then topped by this brutal murder and the failure of people to be held to account, the failure of habeas corpus and the failure of rights. Okay, thanks.
It's a question really. In the torture claims of people who are being tortured by the new regime, are they from any identifiable groups?
It was just who seems to be being targeted by the new regime in terms of torture and attacks and so on.
Generic. I think it would be impossible to say that it was either for any particular individual set of groups. It was certainly has been those who were protesting the need to keep alive the struggle for openness and political liberalisation and democratisation.
This is sort of a question about what's going on now in terms of women's political kind of sovereignty, because as you said, now only 2 women are in the cabinet. Is that a sort of growing trend that you think women's position might be sort of slighted by this, by the fact that the regime's ended, or do you think that this is a chance for women to be empowered by democracy?
Well, I suppose if I gave a shorthand response to that, I'd say it's an empirical question, and let's see how it unfolds. I think it's not surprising that women were not such a strong core element of the new cabinet. I think the debates about women in the square and the role that they played in the struggle is absolutely important and has been very important for informing a kind of gender politics post-revolution. But there has also been a quite dramatic increase in sexual harassment and attacks on women that frankly has been a long-standing element or feature of Egyptian society. In fact, this week, the regime, sorry, I must stop calling it the regime, the Egyptian government has announced that it is going to locate CCTV in major areas of Cairo to try and reduce the level of sexual harassment. A lot of the chatter around the webs has been, has been that seeing pictures of the harassment actually ain't going to do anything. What's important is trying to instill a new ideology of equality, to erase what seems to be a kind of systemic misogyny which many women have particularly denounced. So great opportunity, but incredible hurdles to generalize what was an incredible presence of women in the square and in the struggle and which continues. But whether that will be translated somehow automatically into an empowerment depends partly on what you mean by empowerment. Is it just simply being part of the cabinet, or is it actually women in the family, women in the community? And I think that challenge continues.
Thank you. Considering you are not so much in favour of the word revolution or uprising, would you be kind enough to change the terminology, and how would you refer to it in years to come? What was the debacle in Tahrir Square in particular? And secondly, don't you think the term Arab Spring, as widely used in Western media, is a gross oversimplification of Arabic affairs? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I certainly agree with the last point, and I try and avoid the use of Arab Spring, and I try to avoid my students' use of that term. It's as if somehow you undermine the incredible historical struggles of people by associating it with seasons of the year. Equally, there is this idea that somehow there is an awakening, which again, I hope in my attempt to say that there has been a historical context to this uprising, that one shouldn't talk about an awakening. One should instead have a social, political economy of the country context in which these revolutions have taken place. Now, you caught me out, I've used the word revolution, haven't I? A revolution, I suppose it depends on what you understand by that term. I mean, for me, call me old-fashioned, but revolution is really a term which suggests a change in the forces of ownership of the means of production that operate in any particular social formation. That clearly has not happened, and indeed, au contraire, the Brotherhood, the Freedom and Justice Party, are so associated with promoting the salience of a neoliberal agenda, and were indeed even so associated during the Mubarak years, that I have no evidence or hope that there will be a dramatic transformation of the current political economy. Indeed, during the process of electioneering, the Brotherhood were busy politicking in the United States to show just how law and order would be on the agenda, and of course the sanctity of private property rights. Now, the challenge of that is from the left, which frankly has publicly failed, and failed in the process of electoral debate and discussion, to manage to mobilize successfully to erase the popular base of the Islamists. But I think it's no surprise that the Islamists won the election, and won it so overwhelmingly. I mean, absolutely no surprise. They have for decades been the most effective and active social mobilizers in and around communities, and where a state has been so bankrupt in being able to deliver goods and services to its population, the Brotherhood has stepped in and done so, not only through the mosque, but also through other aid and charities. So yes, of course, people will vote for that which has been, so supportive of those communities and individuals over an historical period. I think many secularists in Egypt are saying, okay, the Brotherhood have got their chance. Let's see what they do and how they do it. And if they don't manage to restore growth, and growth that's not simply sustainable, but can also generate an improvement in living standards across the board, then they will be out. The slogan, Islam is the way, is a gross simplification of trying to understand the dynamics of a modern economy. But the agenda they have set themselves is very much an agenda of continuing a road of privatization of and sanctity of property rights. You remind me, though, if I may, just say one thing further on this. I think we have to ask something that vexes me really is why is it that the military turn against Mubarak? Military don't like turning against chains of command. They certainly don't like doing that if they have been appointed by the Commander-in-Chief, which all these guys, all the generals, have been with Mubarak. So this for me requires if it were possible, but it's dangerous to do so, some real research into what was the underpinning conflict within the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, and why actually did they not want Gamal, the boy wonder, to step up and become president as the first president since Nasser who would not be from the military. Now, there may be some of that swank around we've got to have a military person in charge, but that could perhaps be offset by having a military as a vice president. But I actually think that one of the problems the military had was that Gamal was promoting a modified strategy of economic reform, of liberalisation, which was having all the deleterious effects socially and on Egyptians that I've mentioned, but which potentially might challenge the monopoly of different economic sectors controlled by the military. So actually, the military saw this as an opportunity with this uprising to jettison a policy that had been so effectively, well, not effectively actually, but had been promoted for many decades, certainly since Egypt's promotion of economic reform in 1991, but economic liberalisation in Egypt's countryside from 1987. So we have a long history of economic reform, and then why don't the military concede the idea that there should be some moderated political reform which will allow a non-military person to step up and become president? I think it's because Gamal is associated too much with the US and too much with economic reform and the potential anyway that market forces might challenge monopolies of the military. We know that actually the market reform that was being put in place was not doing any of those things, incidentally. It was a crony capitalism which was rewarding those associated and linked to the old regime. But it does raise some questions as to why they dumped Mubarak. There was a rumor after that after the first speech he makes, when everybody thinks he's going to go. Everybody said, "Oh, senile guy isn't going to go." Then after the second speech, he said, "I'll go, but I'm not going to." And this was confusing in the film actually. He doesn't say, "Oh, he's going," and Suleiman is taking over. He says, "Suleiman will become vice president, but I'm staying until September." And then I hear that the US State Department contacts Eriam and Tantawi, the field marshal, and says, "Look, when we say Mubarak's got to go, we don't mean September, we mean tomorrow." Now, hearsay, rumour, gossip, full speculation, all of those things. But the US was slow to get up to this issue, as were the Brotherhood, incidentally. But the US were even slower, and when they got there, they really were left thinking, how can we massage a transition that if we get rid of our erstwhile ally, what do we do and have in its place? That's quite a long-winded response to your question.
Is it actually dangerous for the West and USA to simplify all those different countries? There may be Arabs, but they're not different. For example, from Maghreb, as far as I'm concerned, right here from here, is totally different from like the Middle East per se. What is European? Is it? I think it's it's dangerous to inflame the spirit of people, making erroneous assumptions. But because those countries, surely, under your correction, have got different specificities. Why do we use the word Arab state? I've never been into something.
Well, it's a kind of it's a simplification which is used throughout people who study politics of the global south. If people talk about the African state or African politics or Middle East politics, it's a nonsense. Unless, as you say, you look at the specificities of particular social historical circumstances and how and why they emerged and what the challenges to the status quo are, and then how the different economies have been forged historically and what the different lines of contestation and conflict are. I mean, I'm sure there are some social scientists here, isn't that what we are all charged to do? The United States have always had bad intelligence in the Middle East. I mean, this is just gross, and they've suffered, and American GIs on the ground have suffered as a result of that. But they've been funding the old regime to the tune of $1.3 billion a year in military assistance. Military assistance alone, $1.3 billion. And so they had some vested interests in wanting to know what was going to happen with the hardware that the boys had been playing with in the Egyptian military.
There was a comment in the film when a group were talking in the square about Luxor and Sharm el-Sheikh not being associated with what was going on. Is that an actual separation in the country, or was that just chit-chat?
Well, I mean, it's good that you picked up on that. I mean, Luxor and Sharm, of course, are the places where many Europeans go for their holidays. And so there was the assumption that, those who are working in the tourist centres were counter-revolutionaries. And indeed, there was the assumption that on the day of the camel, when the horse riders and the camels come charging in, the thugs are paid for by the regime, and many of them were people who worked by the pyramids. The horses that were used in that day of the camel came from the pyramid stables, which were now empty because the tourists had run away. So it's not that there's a formal separation, although Mubarak has himself a rather large estate in Sharm, and that's where he was exiled to, pending his court appearance. But it's that, because these are the two centres of tourism, there was the assumption that there were also sources of either counter-revolution or obstacles to revolutionary transformation, because they had the benefits of tourism. I think it was over-egged and overstated. And in the early part of the film, there was some very interesting, that wonderful dialogue with the guy who had come from Port Said, who said, in the next couple of days you're going to bring all his family down, which I thought was, there were demonstrations and occupations and mobilizations in the squares in Port Said and Alexandria, in Minya, in Luxor and Aswan in the south. So this was much more than just a Tahrir arena of contestation, but it was clearly the major source of areas of conflict. But the point that you raised is basically, what are we going to do about tourism? And that was also raised in the film, because people were saying, everybody's complaining. They were complaining because tourist revenue was not forthcoming. So the little shops around the edge of Tahrir are all kind of tourist trinket places. And of course they were part of the gruesome thuggery that were, the roofs of their buildings were being used by the thugs to throw stones and rocks on the crowd below. I must say, the first time I thought about it, when I looked at it, I had a certain I thought there was a certain paradox, that many of the stones that were being broken up had probably been laid by Egyptians who had been funded by the World Bank during periods of austerity following the economic reform period after 1991, when there was a kind of work placement opportunities for people who were unemployed to go and work paid for by the international agencies. So there was this whole process of economic reform that had actually helped conjure up the gross levels of immiseration that led to the background to the revolution, which is then used as part of their weaponry to fight the counter-revolution. Perhaps I'm alone in seeing the irony in that, but I just thought that was just, I thought it was quite significant.
With the Salafis no longer afraid to show their face, what do you think is the percentage chance of Egypt becoming an Islamic state?
I think there is, as I mentioned, a quite a fierce debate about whether the old article of the previous constitution relating to Sharia law informing public legal discourse, whether that continues. The likelihood will be that it will. Whether that would lead to an Islamic state or not, I think is a gross simplification. The Salafists clearly are quite keen and active in trying to accelerate an Islamization, but the Brotherhood, I think, and through its political arm, the Freedom and Justice Party, is not so keen that there would be that kind of dramatization of political Islam in Egypt. I think that's unlikely. It's not to say that it won't be part of the agenda and the debate, but I do not see it as being likely. I think that the demonstration last Friday in Midan Tahrir was, there was a demonstration last Friday, and there's going to be another one tomorrow. And last Friday there was a quite significant mobilization of Islamists and secularists, and they fought. And it was quite a bloody fight. And there was, why were they there? Well, the secularists were somewhat chastened by the release of the draft constitution, but both were outraged at the Attorney General, who had failed to ensure that many of the court cases brought against those who were implicated or charged with the Day of the Camel were released without sentence or found not guilty, insufficient evidence. And partly getting wind of the kind of the wind of popular opinion, Morsi said, "Okay, I'm sacking you," to the Attorney General. And the Attorney General said, "Well, sorry, mate, you can't do that. It's not. That's an extra constitutional act, and it's a kind of act that you would associate with the erstwhile president." So he stood his ground. Morsi wanted to. I'm not quite sure why he wanted to give him this elevated job. He wanted to make him the ambassador of the Vatican. I'm sure that's associated with a certain number of perks. But the Attorney General chose instead to stay in his position, and he's done so, although there have now been some restrictions on the longevity of his post. So, I think what's interesting, and why I mention this, is that that struggle around interpretation of the Constitution, what kind of Constitution is going to be drafted, what the lines of cleavage are between Islamists, which are multivariate, incidentally, not simply a single Islamist agenda, and secularists, who have now become increasingly able to organise themselves under a single umbrella. It's not one umbrella, but a number of umbrellas. These are political struggles that are going to continue. No question about that.